I never needed an excuse to teach from the hit TV series The West Wing, but I found a really good one when I arrived at the ethics section of my Introduction to Religious Studies course. I always have misgivings about teaching a chapter on ethics, not because I'm against ethics or morality, but because it inevitably gets into should you or should you not kind of conversations that I try to steer clear of for the 16 weeks at a time that I get with my Introduction to Religious Studies students. I face the conundrum of trying to get students to suspend the desire to say what is right and what is wrong in a situation, and instead pay more attention to how people arrive at such notions. So I could think of no better way than to take a moral issue presented in The West Wing, particularly the episode that discusses capital punishment, and I invited the criminology class that my colleague Rita Shah taught to join us. We watched the episode and then we had a panel discussion where we invited members from local religious communities as well as an expert in legal studies to join us for a panel conversation on the episode and how the different agendas and concerns are weighed in this very special episode of The West Wing and my first episode of this show, The Outgrowth. Stay with us.
You know, you remind me of the man that lived by the river. He heard a radio report that the river was going to rush up and flood the town, and that all the residents should evacuate their homes. But the man said, I'm religious, I pray. God loves me, God will save me. The waters rose up. A guy in a rowboat came along and he shouted, hey, you in there. The town is flooding. Let me take you to safety. But the man shouted back, I'm religious. I pray. God loves me. God will save me. A helicopter was hovering overhead, and a guy with a megaphone shouted, hey, you down there. The town is flooding. Let me drop this ladder and I'll take you to safety. But the man shouted back that he was religious, that he prayed, that God loved him, and that God would take him to safety. Well, the man drowned. And standing at the gates of St. Peter, he demanded an audience with God. Lord, he said, I'm a religious man. I pray. I thought you loved me. Why did this happen? God said, I sent you a radio report, a helicopter, and a guy in a rowboat. What the hell are you doing here? He sent you a priest, a rabbi, and a Quaker, Mr. President, not to mention his son, Jesus Christ. What do you want from him?
Thank you all very much for being here for this pilot episode of The Outgrowth, where we bring my classroom to you. Our special guests for this West Wing themed episode are Dr. Rita Shah, who is our resident criminologist here at Elizabethtown College, Reverend Amy Shorner-Johnson, who's a chaplain here at the college as well, Dr. Kopko, who does many things here at the college. He is in charge of the honors program. He's a political science professor, as well as the chair of our legal studies program. And we have Pastor Greg Laszakovits, who is a pastor in the Church of the Brethren across the street at E-Town Church of the Brethren, and has also worked for the Church of the Brethren's Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. The episode is entitled, I don't know if you remember this, it starts with a cold open into the title card that says, Take This Sabbath Day. Now this, of course, is an allusion to the biblical commandment to take a day of rest, take a day where you are keeping it holy, keeping it away from work and mundane things that would distract you from the specialness of life, the things that really matter most in the world. So you have this very black and white commandment about taking the Sabbath day, keeping it holy. That begins the episode. And then you jump right into this very morally gray area for the American public. That is capital punishment. And you see people debating, okay, what are we going to do? There's a man's life that is on the line, and something's got to give. Can he be pardoned or not? That's quite the jump. And I'm curious, why is this such a sticking point for the American people? Rita Shah, can you give us a sense of why capital punishment is a sticky point? What are the things that people are batting around?
So there are several issues that tend to come up when we talk about the death penalty. One is just the simple notion of you killed someone, right? And so what does that mean as a society? Do we allow that to stand? What kind of response do we give? Are you now, if you have taken someone else's life, is your life now also worthy or not? And should we take it as well? So that's sort of the main sticking point, right? So now, though, it's definitely the fact that there is a life that's been taken, and there are families who are suffering and hurting, and friends because of that, right?
Kyle Kopko, what can you add?
So the death penalty is a really complex political issue here. First of all, most death penalty cases happen at the state level. I don't think a lot of folks realize that. It's very rare that the federal government executes someone. Most murders happen within state boundaries. They happen to play out in state courtrooms. And a lot of folks elect governors, members of their state legislators, with an eye on this. This is all something that people at the local level have the most say over. And for the most part, it's going to really depend on community standards. Are folks really interested in punishment as a means for implementing the death penalty? Is this a way of getting some sort of justice? Or do community members think that this isn't really a good use of our criminal justice system? Is it a waste of money?
Amy Shorner-Johnson, you also are from the South. You're also a pastor who's lived elsewhere, like myself. How do you see people working through this in your own ministry?
Yeah, so in multiple ways, especially when I was at a church in Georgia, and just recently through some people that I connected with, because I saw some folks really speaking up for both Kelly Gissendaner, who died last year and was the first woman to die in 70 years in the state of Georgia, as well as Troy Davis, who was another person who died. So, but his case was coming up on a regular basis. And so I had a few people in my congregation who were advocating, especially for Troy, because the evidence wasn't necessarily for him. That there were people who would come, though, and be kind of, to me, wrestling with this issue over top as they would serve on a jury. And kind of just saying, like, how do we make these decisions as people who are, having to work with different populations, with issues of evidence, and like, do I trust this evidence? So I think it was like questions of like, what is my role here, and what does that mean for kind of the larger population?
Yeah.
So,
Greg, what have you seen? What are you seeing in the communities where you work?
Well, it's a unique situation in the Church of the Brethren, because they, without giving you the long history, Church of the Brethren came out of a movement where they were politically and religiously the other. They were the radicals. And so because of that, people in the Church of the Brethren movement lived under the threat of the death penalty. And so coming from our religious, our very early religious days, and that was about 300 years ago, so not that long, relatively speaking, but about 300 years ago, Church of the Brethren folks were under the threat of the death penalty. And so I think that has shaded somewhat our view of what it means to be people of faith in the world today. As Christians, they saw that, well, yes, in the Old Testament there are some places where the death penalty would be employed, where you've got scriptures like an eye for an eye, but we read all of that through the lens of the New Testament. And in the New Testament, Jesus said, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye, but I tell you. And then Jesus goes on to create new understandings of where God is, essentially, on these issues.
And Dr. Kopko, I was hoping you could help us understand, what are the political ramifications, what are the stakes for making a decision about the death penalty for like an elected official?
Sure. They can be tremendous, to be perfectly honest. I study judicial politics and constitutional law as my main area of concentration within political science. And a lot of people don't think about the politics of electing judges. We do it in Pennsylvania, many states throughout the country do this too, particularly for their state Supreme Courts. And ultimately, state Supreme Courts are the most influential decision bodies in determining whether or not a death penalty sentence is upheld or overturned. There were several studies throughout the 1980s, 1990s, anonymous interviews with state Supreme Court justices throughout the country, where these scholars asked these justices what your personal viewpoints were on the death penalty, and if you believe they were unconstitutional in the way the death penalty was carried out in their states. And a large number of justices believed that they were unconstitutional. But they realized if they were to ever say that in a courtroom or write that in an opinion, they would be voted out of office. And this has happened throughout the country. There have been actually recall elections for state Supreme Court justices because it's viewed as being soft on crime.
And I wanted to ask you about the perception of crime itself, Dr. Shah.
Sure.
For instance, in the episode, yes, there's sort of a capital offense involved, but drugs are attached to it. And I wonder, how does the public's perception of crime, especially when you add something like drugs and that sort of loaded issue, affect people's view on the death penalty or how we think about capital punishment?
So California is a state that is probably the epitome of direct democracy in this country, where they will often have propositions on their ballots, and then the public votes on specific laws. And so California right now actually has 2 competing death penalty propositions that will be voted on Tuesday. The first one, Proposition 62, is abolishing the death penalty. A yes vote would abolish the death penalty in the state of California. The second one, Proposition 66, would amend the appeals process for the death penalty. So the appeals process moves down to the trial courts and then shortens the amount of time that they have to begin that process. I think it goes down to 5 years, right? So we're about to see, in California at least, which one does the public actually want? Do they want it but amended, or do they want to get rid of it totally? Adding drugs into it becomes a whole other interesting thing, because we have had a very long history of a war on drugs that frankly has been racially tinged. If you look at just about every single law that has been outlawed, every single drug that has been outlawed or criminalized, there is a racial history that goes behind it. You've now added an extra layer of who are we actually criminalizing and who are we actually concerned about?
I'm curious, how did that resonate with you? Is that true to life for the Peace Church to which you belong?
To kill another person is wrong. Jesus is very clear on that. I don't know that he could be any clearer, both in what we have him recorded as saying, as well as just his own life and his own death. You know, he was somebody who was facing the death penalty as well. I mean, we sort of forget that. Jesus was executed by the state. Jesus was a victim of the death penalty. And what did he do? What was his response in that? Was his response to fight back? Was his response an eye for an eye? Was his response to rally the troops, to call down the angels? You know, no, it wasn't any of those things. His response was to continue to fight, but fight non-violently. So it's very clear to us in the Church of the Brethren that the death penalty is never okay.
And Amy Shorner-Johnson, you've participated and are involved in spiritual direction. And I wonder, can you sort of give some insight into the exchange that you saw happening between Father Tom Cavanaugh and Josiah Bartlett?
Yeah, so, I mean, I see kind of from that spiritual direction side, I think a lot of times spiritual direction is kind of like a partnership with another kind of wisdom giver in kind of learning and trying to find our own quest of the next thing that we're supposed to do on our own spiritual path. One of the signs that I think we're looking for is sometimes to do some harder work, which to me also is asking a question ultimately of what it means to be human. What is a normal human experience? What is a just human experience? In some ways, by one gentleman who was on death row who said, you know, here on death row is the first time I wish somebody had cared about me as much as they do now the rest of my life.
How would you, in this fictional universe, counsel President Bartlett?
I would counsel what I know in terms of the data. Here's what I know in the terms of the data. And the poll that I'm about to say would be relevant because this was the 90s, and so we've had this data out around this time. When you survey people on their views of the death penalty, first of all, the support for the death penalty is going down consistently. But when you survey them, even if a majority of individuals say, yes, death penalty, go for it, if you then ask them, what if you put them in life in prison without parole? What about that option? Support for the death penalty drops significantly. President Bartlett says 71% of the people support the death penalty. My response would be, well, sure, but they support life without parole in prison even more. So there's one way out.
So I think I would go with my spiritual direction kind of background, and because too, especially the way that Jed Bartlett reacts at the end, where he actually asks for a confession, I would kind of spat back to him, I think you know the answer. You have been given everything. Mm-hmm. You know the answer. It is a matter of doing the work to look inside yourself for the answer.
It would be a very, very tough conversation, I think, for any of us. Ultimately, even though I'm Catholic, even though I have my own personal views on the death penalty, I'd remind the president that his job is to faithfully execute the laws. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we see as a distinction here in this episode, putting aside your personal convictions about what you personally believe to be right and what you believe to be the legal obligation under the laws of the United States and given the political process that has played out.
This may seem like cheating, but if I were, I would view it two ways. If I were his chief of staff, I would give an answer very similar to the one you gave. But with the addition that, Mr. President, since you feel this way, we need to work to change those laws. Mm-hmm. And so you need to have a statement that essentially says, I'm going to allow this to go forward. However, I recognize that it's unjust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So one of the sort of larger pieces that comes out of this conversation for me as we close is that these issues of morality are not just about what is right and what is wrong. But I mean, I think if you spend any minute of, any amount of time wrestling with it, you know that it's how people arrive at these answers that plays a big part in it, right? Is it I'm just doing the best that I can? Is it that the ends are going to justify the means? Is it that there are these moral absolutes that I must meet to? And beyond just the decision making, it's also the ramifications for that decision on the world you fit into. How do you want to fit into it on the other side of the decision? And what does it mean about your relationship to the sources that helped you get to that solution or that decision in the first place? None of this happens in a vacuum. You are in front of a mantle of people who are watching you back as well. And that's something that, for better or worse and at varying degrees, weighs heavily on us. I think the question before us as people observing this happening is, why is it that we fail to see that that's the burden that the other faces as well? The person we see is diametrically opposed. What happens to us that makes us think, well, they just got it so wrong and they're nothing like me, or I would have done it so differently. When if we follow President Bartlett on this great walk and talk, we might end up in the exact same place. We have no idea, or maybe we do have an idea, but we can respect the process that he got there. It seems like the process is as big of a part of morality as the solution itself that we run into.
So how do we know the difference between right and wrong? I think the answer to that question is the product of a lot of moral calculations that take into consideration political ramifications, our social relationships, our willingness to bend on a philosophical ideal or ideology. It also has to do with things like formation and to whom we go to for answers. And it also has to do with the future that we're creating and the past we choose to cite as we come to make sense of the decisions that are before us. The drama is not just in this episode of The West Wing, but it's in life around us. We hope you'll join us to seek out the complexities of this and many more things on our next episode of The Outgrowth. Until next time.